Hi, good morning, everybody. A guten Erev Shabbos. So let us continue with the halacha that we started yesterday about trying to pass off flawed currency over to somebody else. If indeed that uh, other person is going to have difficulty using that money as currency because it's not going to be accepted everywhere. So then it's usher for me to use it as currency to try and pass it off as such. And that could also fall into the category of ona'ah. And he had said that with currency, you have to be even more machmir than with other goods. That with other goods, if you're off up to a sixth, it's not actionable. There's nothing to do about it. But with currency, even a twelfth is going to be up to if it's a twelfth or more, it's going to be a problem. And so we mentioned that this does not have a lot of practical applications in today's world, where things are minted properly, and our currency is paper, and it's much more noticeable when something is flawed. But as you'll see, it does have applications as far as a very important halacha that is not exactly ona'ah, but is related to ona'ah, as we'll see in just a second. So let's take a look at halacha yud today. If you do have a coin in your possession that has a twelfth or more of it deficient, asur l'kaimo beveso, mipnei shebekal meramin bo lahotzia biyafeh, then you're not even allowed to have that item in your house, because you're not allowed to harbor in your possession something that could be used to harm other people. So what do we mean by that? In other words, if you have something that intrinsically could be used by a dishonest person to deceive other people, so you're really not supposed to have it even in your home, because at some point someone else may get a hold of it and cause deception to other people. Shenemar lo yihi alacha beveischa v'goymer shelo yavo l'ramos bo kamo sheyispoyer. We're going to see later on in a separate siman, a separate chapter, the halacha of even harboring in your possession faulty weights and measures. Actually, it's actually in this parsha, but later on. What we're going to see is that having a weight or a scale that is faulty, even if you're not going to use it to deceive customers, because let's say you have it in your basement and it's covered up with a dust cloth or whatever, it doesn't matter. Even having it in your home is an isser deoraisa, because it could potentially be used for the public's detriment by some person who is unscrupulous. And therefore, what are you supposed to do with such a thing? What if you have something in your home like faulty currency or counterfeit currency or things like that, or things that could be used to deceive, like a faulty scale or something like that? So he says, "V'lo yimserenu la'anos olutagar mipnei shemeramin bo acherim." So when it comes to the faulty currency, don't give it to people who use coercion in order to get people to do their will. Do not give it to professional merchants, because they too will use it and exploit other people with it. Velo ya'asenu mishkal, nor should you take that currency and use it as a weight, like a paper weight or some other kind of weight to weigh things with. Velo yizrakenu l'soch shivrei kesef, nor should you just throw it in. Let's say it has silver content. Don't just throw it in with a bunch of other ingots or pieces of silver. Shaharei asur l'kaimo shema yavo acher v'yarama bo lahotzia biyafeh, because you're not allowed to hold it in your possession, because someone else may come along one day and you have long forgotten about this faulty coin and you just put it in your drawer, and someone else may come along. Someone unscrupulous will come along and use it to exploit others. So rather, what should you do with it? Ella yatichenu o yikavenu be'emtsao, litlos bitzavar bito. He says what you could do is you could cut it in half, or you could drill a hole in the center of it so that you could make it into a piece of jewelry for your daughter. So that's what you are allowed to do with it. In other words, completely deface it to the point where it's clearly unusable anymore for currency. Avalo yikavenu min hatzad, shema yavo acher v'yachtov makam haneket. But what you can't do is, let's say, puncture it on the side to make like a little dent in it, because someone could come along and shave down the dent and then make it also again counterfeit. V'im chaser ad she'amad al chetzio kegon sela she'amad al shekel v'shekel she'amad al dinar v'dinar al chetzio mutter l'kaimo she'az ef she'leramos bo mipnei she'hapachas shelo nikar lakol. If it is so reduced in size that it's half of its original size, so then you're allowed to keep it, because then people will clearly see that it's no longer the same coin that it used to say, that, or at least that the face says that it is. Aval im amad al pachos mechetzio asur l'kaimo b'mnei she'efshel l'ramos bo lahotzio b'chetzio shu shekel o dinar achatzi dinar keven shehem matbeos hayotzim. He says, but if it is reduced to less than half of its size, then you have to be concerned that maybe someone will pass it off as half of the denomination that it was and will deceive others with it. In other words, whatever could be reasonably used to deceive others, you're not allowed to have in your possession. Umatbeya she'ein lochin oso elo b'mishkal mutter l'kaimon b'chol inyan shekol halokeach yishkalenu. If, of course, you are dealing in a social situation where everyone in society weighs the coins as a means of determining its value, so then you don't have to worry about all of these halachas, because the recipient will weigh the metal in the coin before accepting it. So of course that would obviate the whole problem if people use currency by weight, but that's certainly not the way most more modern societies function. And so therefore you do have to worry about this. The chiddush in this halacha is lo yihiya lecha beveischa. The Torah says that you're not allowed to harbor anything in your possession, even if you don't plan to use it. You can't keep it in your possession if there's an opportunity for it to harm other people. And of course, anything that is, this halacha, by the way, applies to not just things that can be used to deceive people, but anything that can be used for the detriment of the public, such as a dangerous animal, right? Having a rattlesnake as a pet or a boa constrictor also doesn't fall under this pasuk, but the Torah would also asur it for the same reason, that anything that can present a hazard to the public, it is asur for you to keep in your home. Okay? Raises some questions about gun control and things like that, but you're all good Canadians, so you wouldn't know about such things. Anyway, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, and then I want you to look at the Biurim for just a second. V'chol matbeya v'chulei, he says any coin that you have that is defective should not be harbored in your possession. Lachein shtaros kesef mezuyafos asur l'kaimon ulachzikan beveso. Then it goes without saying that counterfeit money you're not allowed to keep in your home, even as a memento, right? Because someone could eventually get hold of it and use it for nefarious purposes. Mechatzi shtus, that even if it's defective 1/12 of its weight or more, then it's a problem. This is consistent with the Rav Shulchan Aruch Shita that we learned in yesterday's halacha, that he holds that with coins you have to be more machmir than with other merchandise. With other merchandise, it's a 6th, but with coins it's a 12th. Shebekal miramin bo, he says, because it's very easy to deceive people when you have a defective coin. Dahamakablo inu mabchin bo kolkach shechasar mimenu chatzi shtus, because person who receives the coin among a whole bunch of other coins does not immediately detect that there's a deficiency in one of the coins, and that's why it can be used to deceive people. V'lo yimserenu la'anos, you should not give it to someone else who will potentially use it to exploit others, like a person who deals aggressively with other people or with a professional. The Rambam v'Shulchan Aruch Hagirsa v'lo yimkarena kol panim mashma de la'acherim she'enam anosim v'tagorim shari limsar. He says it seems like it's only you're not allowed to give it to other people who will use it to exploit others. But if you someone who is not a professional merchant or someone who will not exploit other people, it seems like you're allowed to give it to that person, ostensibly for the purposes of, let's say the guy says, listen, I can deal with all of your defective coins because I'm a smelter, I'm a smith, and I'll melt them all down and I'll turn it into a bar. Even though we said before that you're not allowed to have such a coin in your possession, you have to melt it down. Yesh lomar delami she'eno tagar shari limsar manas shehem yasu kedin v'lo yishtamshu b'lo ramos. What the Rav Shulchan Aruch is implying here is that you don't have to immediately suspect that anyone that you give it to is going to use it for nefarious purposes. If a person, you can give it to a person who tells you that they will dispose of it properly. Or they'll make a piece of jewelry out of it for their daughter, which is different from a professional merchant who deals constantly with money. There you have to worry that he's going to use it for unscrupulous purposes. And finally, al pachos mechetzio v'chulei, Rod Salomar shenipchas hashekel yoser mechetzio. He says in a situation where the coin is now shaved down or reduced to less than half of what it was, then you have to worry that again, someone will use it for deceptive purposes because they'll pass it off as a $50 instead of $1 that it originally was, and but people will be deceived nonetheless, depending upon what the currency is and how it can be mistaken for something else. Okay, I also want to take a look at the biurim over here, because he expands this halacha to other commodities as well, where if you keep it in your home, it could potentially deceive other people. So here we were talking about currency. Are there other kinds of scenarios that you could think of? I mean, I could tell you this right now. What if you have a knockoff of a Rolex watch, right? Or you have a knockoff of a Gucci bag? Or Ron, is Ron on the call? What are some good examples in your industry?
Well, I was thinking about the Action comic book behind you. I mean, if it was a fake comic book that looked real, so that people could pass it off as real, I was thinking about that earlier.
There's a lot of counterfeiting in the comic book business. You know, Action Comics #1 has been reprinted many times. So but there, since it's been reprinted many times, not for counterfeiting purposes, but rather so that people can read it. So, but yeah, there you'd have to be really nefarious to pass it off as the original. But
paintings, Rembrandt, Picasso.
Yeah, any kind of counterfeitable item or an item that is counterfeit is going to be a problem to even have it in your possession unless it's clear that it's not the original. Like if you have a painting of the Mona Lisa in your house, I would venture to say that it's not the original because that one's in the Louvre. So it's okay for you to have a reproduction of the Mona Lisa in your house. But let's say it's a really good ripoff of a Picasso or something like that. So then it could potentially fall under this halacha. Definitely is certainly a shaila, unless there's something to identify it as a counterfeit. But what's also very prevalent is watches and Gucci bags and other designer bags that are regularly in the East and in the Middle East are regularly replicated by counterfeiters. Are you allowed to even own such a watch that is a ripoff? It's not a Rolex, but it says Rolex on it. So it would seem that even if you only want it for personal use, but it could be that there's a halachic problem of harboring it in your possession because someone else might get a hold of it and then try to pass it off as a bona fide Rolex and sell it on the market. So all of these things have to be considered. So that brings me to the biurim. V'lo yimserenu la'anas o l'tagar. Do not give it to someone who could use it, this defective coin, who could use it to deceive others. Yesh la'ayin ha'im din ze omer rak b'matbeya. O shemagam b'sha'ar devarim hukein. He says we have to think about this. Like, how far does this extend? If it extends to other things where there's a slight defect in the product, does it apply as well to those things? He says, I'll give you an example in the Jewish world. Sofer shekosaf mezuzah utfilin v'nimtza bahem she'ela. Let's say you have a sofer who has a mezuzah in his possession that he's written or he's acquired from another sofer, and there's a problem with the mezuzah. V'hachacham pasak dehem ksherim rak b'dargas di'evet. And they were brought to a posek, someone who could look at the mezuzah and paskin whether it's kosher or not kosher. And he says it's kosher, but it's only b'di'evet kosher. It's not a lichatchila mezuzah. It's a b'di'evet kosher mezuzah. Ha'imutr l'sofer l'mochrim l'tagar u'lahodia lo sha'al pi hadin him ksherim rak b'di'evet. So now I, as a merchant, a person who is a purveyor of mezuzahs, that's my business. I export mezuzahs to North America, let's say. I'm living in Israel, I export mezuzahs to North America, and I've received one of the mezuzahs as merchandise, is a mezuzah that is only kosher b'di'evet. Am I allowed to ship that off to a bunch of Judaica stores for them to sell as mezuzahs lechatchila? Because they're not going to care, right? So, and the halachic obligation, like he writes in the brackets, the chayavin bazel hodia lekona. You have a halachic obligation to notify the person that you're selling the mezuzah to that it's only kosher b'di'evet, it's not kosher lechatchila. So I go ahead and I give this disclosure to all of the Judaica stores that I'm sending mezuzahs to, that let's say I even went ahead and did that, even though that's not normally done. I give them notification that these mezuzahs are not lechatchila mezuzahs, they're b'di'evet mezuzahs. You have to be concerned that maybe the store who's going to sell it or the merchant who's going to sell that mezuzah will not reveal that information to the purchaser, to the end user. And we're talking about a situation where it's not clear when the naked eye looks at this mezuzah, unless you're very, very discerning, it's very hard to see that there's anything wrong with the mezuzah. And it would seem that there should be no difference between this example that I've provided or any other merchandise, where the defect of the merchandise is really not that detectable. Shaharei gam biyayin isa bebava metzia daf samach amad aleph uveshulchan aruch siman reish chav ches sif yud beis v'nifsa kein lekaman b'divrei harav sif chav beis da aser lemachro letagar ayin sham. He says, we'll see a halacha later on in this chapter. Let's say I am a wholesaler who has received from a manufacturer wine. But the problem with the wine is that too much water was added to it. So its water and wine ratio is different from the standard wine-water ratio in this locale. I'm not allowed to give it to a wholesaler who will act as a distributor. Why am I not allowed to give it to him? Because I have to suspect that he's going to try to pass it off as regular wine. So anytime that you have a situation where you have flawed merchandise, you're not allowed to give it to someone who may pass it off as bona fide merchandise that is unflawed. In kain mashma shebechol davar hadin kain, he says, and it would therefore seem that with all merchandise, the halacha would apply. And he says the problem is v'hasofrim nohagin lahakel bazev etzarchim. The problem that we have in today's world is that the sofrim in the safras business, they're not careful about this. They aren't meticulous about this halacha, and they will send off to vendors. They will send off mezuzahs that are not kosher lechatchila, and they're only kosher b'di'evit. So he says, I don't know on what basis they act with leniency, but it would seem that this is problematic from this halacha. So, questions, comments?
Is this all based on a lifnei iver kind of? Is that what's behind this? Really?
It seems from the pasuk that it's a separate halacha, that you're not allowed to harbor. You're not allowed to keep a faulty weight in your possession. What's the pasuk that we said? It's based on lo yihiyeh lecha beveischa. The Torah says you're not allowed to have in your house efa ve'efa, different weights that weigh different amounts, even though they say it's the same weight on it. So it's a special isser. It could be that it's based upon lifnei iver, but it is actually a separate mitzvah lo saseh, lo yihiyeh lecha beveischa. If you want, I can show you the what the Sefer HaChinuch writes on that mitzvah. Here, just give me 1 second. I'll bring up the Sefer HaChinuch, and you'll take a look. Hold on just a second. Bring up the Sefer HaChinuch catalog. There we go. So I'll share this with you. New share. So the Sefer HaChinuch writes, this is mitzvah Taf Reish Beis, Shenimnanu shelo lahashos es hamishkolim v'hamaznayim hacheserim beveiteinu, that we're not allowed to, according to this mitzvah, to have in our houses any faulty weights and measures. Va'afal pi shelo nisa v'nitein b'mekachenu uv'mimkarenu bahen, pen yihi elanu l'mokesh. Even if we ourselves are not using these faulty weights and measures, there's a concern that it will be a stumbling block or a snare for other people sometime in the future. Ve'al zeh ne'emar lo yihi lecha b'chischa even va'aven gedola u'ketana. V'chein lo yihi lecha b'veischa efa ve'efa. That's the language of the pasuk. You cannot have differing weights that weigh different things because different amounts, because they could deceive others in the future. V'chein amar zichronam livracha bevava basra. Asr la'adam she'isha mida chasera o yisera b'soch beisov afilu hu avit shel mei raglayim. A person cannot have a faulty weight in his house, even if he currently uses it as a urinal. In other words, just because you've converted it into something else, that doesn't give you a right to harbor it. If it's a fraudulent item that could be used in the future to deceive others, even if you're using it for something totally inert, totally harmless, it doesn't matter. And then he quotes the Rambam, who says, "Va'al tachshov shiyu shnei mitzvos achar shehem shnei lavin, amnam ba'u lahashlim dinei hamitzvah ad sheyichalalo shnei minei hashir vehem hamishkol vehamida." He says the Rambam writes that it's one mitzvah, but the reason why it's written in different ways in the pasuk is to tell me that it includes things that are faulty weights and faulty measures. Ki'ilu hu omer lo yilecha shnei shiurim lo b'mida v'lo b'mishkol, kama lo sashich le'achicha neshech kesef neshech ochel neshech kol davar asher yishach. Similarly, when the Torah prohibits charging interest on a loan, it says, it uses multiple terminology. Why? Because to tell me shahakol lav echad, it's one prohibition, but the doubling up of the language is to tell you that it's inclusive of all different kinds of interest. So skip to the next paragraph, and he writes, Mishor she mitzvah zuk tzas dinah kemin hagei b'sefer hazeh kasafti b'sefer kedoshim tiyu. It's basically all b'mitzvah tzidu kamoznaim v'hazar shelo l'shaker bahem u'misham tira mashitzarach lecha b'zu. He says, I've already written mostly about this, but it's really under the rubric of being truthful and not to be deceitful in any way. So, in other words, the mitzvah of it's connected to the mitzvah of kedoshim to you, and it's connected to the mitzvah of tziduk hamoznayim, of having correct weights in mitzvah reish nun ches, and the commandment of not being deceitful in these areas. So what does he say in mitzvah reish nun ches? Probably similarly more of the same. But all right. Anyway, any questions, comments?
So, Rabbi, like we said about putting a hole in a coin so that it's obvious that it's no longer meant to be used for what it's used for. If you had, for example, old-fashioned scale that nobody uses anymore, or those old weights that you used to put on the scale,
Right.
could you own those now? Because no one would ever come to use those for weighing for business purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good argument. I think that's a convincing argument, Paul. You'd have to make that determination that this item is not going to be used by anyone to deceive other people in the future, right? So if it's one of those old scales and it's way off, it's not calibrated correctly, so maybe it would be okay. I'm not sure. If it's clearly an antique, then maybe it's okay. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I would be leery of owning a scale or weights that are faulty using that kind of defense, because it's an explicit Isser de'oraisa of let there not be faulty weights and measures in your home.
Yeah, that's why I picked that one, because I guess there's much more leeway on the others,
right.
the extrapolations we made.
I think you would have more leeway on other things that where it's clear that it can't be used to deceive other people. All right. Let me wish you all unless there's any more questions. All right. Let me wish you all a good Shabbos then. And any good
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbos, Shabbat.
Shabbos, Rabbi.
Wayne workings in Yerushalayim, Ira Kodesh.
Always mitzuyan me'od.
How's have the levels come down? I mean, are people safe?
The levels are not down, and the government has started to close down a little bit again, such as synagogues. And of course, the borders aren't open. So they're trying to, find a way to adjust without closing the economy down.
Let's hope everyone stays healthy.
Because I think the
That's tough.
yeshiva and
It's a
seminary
real
students are
toughie.
planning to come in some ways.
Yeah, they are planning to have a good Shabbat.
Yeah, they're
everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat
Take care,
Shalom.
Rabbi.